in the shadowed corridors of power, where marble floors still echoed with the footsteps of men who believed their decisions would last forever. A single choice could unravel an entire world. Empires do not always fall to the sword or the plague. Sometimes they are dismantled by the very hands that claim to protect them. Political choices, made in quiet chambers and under the weight of ambition, fear, or short-sighted calculation, have sealed the fate of civilizations more completely than any invading army. What follows is the story of how those choices, repeated across centuries and continents, turned order into irreversible rupture. The collapse did not announce itself with thunder. It arrived in decrees, alliances, and refusals that seemed reasonable at the time. Before the fractures became visible, daily life in the heart of the empire continued with the rhythm of routine. Markets filled at dawn with the smell of fresh bread and the murmur of merchants arguing over weights. Soldiers marched in formation along roads that had carried legions for generations. Families gathered under oil lamps to share meals, speaking of harvests, marriages, and the distant campaigns that kept the borders secure. The architecture of authority still stood unbroken. Forums where laws were debated, temples where rituals affirmed continuity, and administrative offices where scribes recorded taxes and troop movements with meticulous care. Citizens walked streets that felt permanent. A system that governed them appeared as solid as the stone under their feet. Yet within the highest circles, decisions were already being weighed that would hollow out that solidity from the inside. The early warning signs arrived not as catastrophe, but as quiet adjustments. A frontier province was granted greater autonomy in exchange for loyalty that later proved conditional. Tax policies were altered to favor influential landowners, leaving the central treasury thinner than reports admitted. Military commands were handed to men whose primary allegiance was to their own advancement, rather than to the continuity of the state. These measures were presented as pragmatic. Officials spoke of efficiency and flexibility. No public proclamation declared that the foundation was shifting. The population continued its routines, unaware that the political calculus of survival had begun to prioritize immediate stability over structural endurance. By the time the signs became clearer, the margin for correction had already narrowed. Tension rose through a series of calculated compromises that each seemed minor in isolation. Alliances with external groups were sealed through treaties that promised protection in return for service. Yet those same groups were allowed to settle inside the borders, with their own leaders intact. Succession disputes were resolved not by clear law, but by the temporary dominance of one faction over another, leaving resentment to accumulate in the shadows of the court. Currency was debased to fund immediate needs, eroding the trust that held commercial life together. Each decision was defended as necessary. Advisors argued that the alternative was chaos. What no one fully articulated was that the accumulation of these choices was itself the slow manufacture of chaos. The system still functioned, but its capacity to absorb further strain was quietly disappearing. Key decisions crystallized the trajectory. When confronted with pressure along distant frontiers, the choice was made to withdraw legions rather than reinforce them, reallocating resources to the political center. When provincial governors requested greater authority to manage local threats, that authority was granted, without corresponding mechanisms of accountability. When internal rivals threatened to fracture the ruling elite, the response was not institutional reform, but the elimination of opponents through intrigue and temporary coalitions. These were not acts of sudden madness. They were the product of men operating under the constraints of their time, measuring short-term survival against long-term cohesion, and consistently selecting the former. The collapse did not begin with open rebellion. It began with the quiet acceptance that the old rules no longer constrained those who held power. The moment the system began to fail was not marked by a single decree. It revealed itself in the growing inability of the center to enforce its will at the edges. Tax collection became uneven. Military units answered first to their immediate commanders. Provincial elites negotiated separately with external powers. The administrative machinery continued to produce documents and appointments, yet the connection between written order and lived reality frayed. Officials still spoke the language of continuity. The forms of governance remained, but the substance that had once bound the whole together had been traded away in successive political bargains. By the time the signs became clear, it was already too late to reverse the erosion, without dismantling the very structures the leadership depended upon for its own position. Human consequences unfolded in the spaces between official narratives. In the cities, the reliable supply of grain grew intermittent. Workshops that had operated for generations closed when raw materials failed to arrive, or when coinage lost its accepted value. Families that had once planned futures around inheritance and trade found themselves negotiating survival day by day. In the countryside, the absence of consistent protection left communities exposed to raids that the central authority could no longer prevent or punish. Trust, the invisible architecture that had allowed strangers to cooperate under a common legal order, dissolved. People turned inward, to kin, to local strongmen, to whoever could offer immediate security. The political choices made in distant halls translated into emptied markets, abandoned roads, and the quiet terror of uncertainty that settled over ordinary lives. Social breakdown accelerated as the remaining institutions lost legitimacy. Justice, once administered with at least the appearance of impartiality, became a matter of who could command force in a given locality. Public rituals that had once reinforced collective identity continued, but their meaning thinned. Crowds still gathered, yet the shared assumption that the system would endure no longer held. Some sought protection by aligning with the very external groups that had been invited inside the borders. Others retreated into private fortifications of wealth or faith. The political elite, still maneuvering for advantage within a shrinking circle of power, continued to issue proclamations that fewer and fewer people believed. The rupture was not only institutional, it was the collapse of the expectation that tomorrow would resemble today. The long-term historical impact stretched far beyond the immediate generation that lived through the failure. Successor regimes inherited territories that no longer shared a common administrative language or fiscal capacity. Trade networks that had once linked distant regions contracted. Knowledge systems, dependent on the patronage and stability of the old order, fragmented. New political forms emerged from the wreckage, some of them more resilient, others merely temporary. The memory of the prior system lingered as both warning and nostalgia. Later chroniclers would debate which specific decision had been decisive, yet the deeper truth remained that no single act stood alone. The fate had been sealed by a sequence of choices that prioritized the preservation of power in the short term over the maintenance of the conditions that made that power possible. Across other civilizations, the pattern repeated, with variations of detail, but consistent underlying logic. In one case, a ruling council chose to suppress reform movements rather than integrate their demands, transforming manageable discontent into revolutionary rupture. In another, an emperor elected to centralize authority so completely that the removal of a single figure left the entire apparatus without direction. Elsewhere, elites opted to fund internal rivalries through the sale of public offices, hollowing out competence until the state could no longer perform its basic functions. Each instance demonstrated that political choices carry consequences that outlast the lifetimes of those who make them. The collapse arrives not as sudden catastrophe, but as the cumulative result of decisions that seemed, in their moment, rational, necessary, or unavoidable. Yet the process was never purely mechanical. Human ambition, fear of losing status, the desire to leave a legacy, and the simple inability to see beyond the horizon of immediate threats all shaped the calculations. Advisors presented options framed by the assumptions of their age. Rulers selected among those options, according to the pressures they felt most acutely. The tragedy lay in the fact that the pressures themselves were often the product of earlier choices. A decision to weaken one institution in order to strengthen another created vulnerabilities that later required further compromises. The system entered a feedback loop, in which each attempt to stabilize the present further undermined the foundations of the future. By the time the loop became visible, the capacity to break it had already been bargained away. In the final phases, the remaining political actors continued to act as though the old framework still held. Negotiations were conducted, titles were conferred, and ceremonial forms were observed. These performances provided a measure of psychological continuity, even as the material basis of order disintegrated. For those living through it, the experience was not always one of dramatic apocalypse. It was the gradual realization that the structures they had trusted no longer responded to the same logic. Roads that once carried official messages now carried only private travelers. Courts that once settled disputes now settled nothing. The silence that followed the failure of institutions was more profound than any battle cry. It was the silence of a system that had exhausted its own capacity to adapt. The reflective weight of these histories lies in the recognition that political choice is never exercised in a vacuum. Every decision is constrained by prior decisions, by the distribution of power at a given moment, and by the limits of knowledge available to those who decide. Yet within those constraints, alternatives existed. Paths that prioritize long-term cohesion over short-term advantage were available, even if they demanded sacrifices that the decision-makers were unwilling or unable to make. The sealing of fate occurred not because no other options existed, but because the options that preserved the system required a different calculus of risk and reward than the one that prevailed. The record of collapses is also a record of roads not taken. What remains after the rupture is not only the physical landscape of ruins and successor states. It is the enduring question of how societies recognize the point at which incremental political adjustments begin to accumulate into irreversible transformation. The answer is rarely clear in the moment. The warnings are quiet. The language of necessity is persuasive. The benefits of delay appear immediate while the costs are deferred. Only later, when the deferred costs arrive in full, does the sequence of choices reveal its true direction. The documentary record of fallen systems is filled with such delayed reckonings. They stand as evidence that the architecture of order is more fragile than it appears when the machinery still functions. In the end, the political choices that sealed the fate of these civilizations were made by people who believed they were navigating the challenges of their time with the best information available to them. They were not cartoon villains or prophets of destruction. They were participants in a complex system whose internal logic rewarded certain kinds of calculation and punished others. The system itself shaped the range of possible decisions. Once those decisions began to erode the system's capacity to correct course, the process acquired a momentum of its own. The collapse, when it came, was both the outcome of human agency and the product of structural dynamics that had been set in motion long before the final crisis. The silence that follows such failures is never complete. Fragments of the old order persist in memory, in law, in the habits of those who survive. New political forms rise from the remnants, carrying both the lessons and the unresolved contradictions of what came before. The study of these ruptures does not offer simple formulas for avoidance. It offers instead a clearer view of the mechanisms by which choices accumulate into destiny. The empires that vanished did so not because history is predetermined, but because the political decisions made within them closed off the paths that might have preserved continuity. What remains is the record of those decisions, and the worlds they left behind. The final measure of these histories is not the grandeur of what was lost, but the precision with which the process of loss can be traced. From the first quiet adjustment to the last ineffective decree, the sequence is legible. The collapse did not begin with chaos. It began with the belief that each individual choice was manageable. By the time that belief was tested against reality, the capacity to reverse course had already been spent. The fate of the system had been sealed not in a single dramatic moment, but across a long chain of political calculations that, taken together, made the outcome inevitable.